Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm Shihoko Goto, the director of the Wilson Center's Asia program. I'm also a proud member of the executive board of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C. And on behalf of the Wilson Center and the Society, a very warm welcome to you for those who are here today on a rainy Washington morning. And thank you to for those who are logging in today online, wherever you are. We're very excited to be able to host this event, the Japan Society's annual outlook on Japan for the year. I would like to thank the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C.'s president, Ryan Schaefer in particular, for allowing us to host this event today. And without further ado, I would like to introduce the Wilson Center's president and CEO, Ambassador Mark Green, to start us off. Thank you, Ambassador.
So thank you, Shihoko. And I thank Shihoko for a couple of reasons. Number one, for introducing me, but also for allowing me to do something that my wife actually cares about. And what I mean by that is, she was an exchange student at Kansai Gaidai University, and it is only when I'm able to do things with our Japanese friends that she actually thinks I do something constructive and worthwhile. So, great. It's really good to have you here. Welcome. You know, the Wilson Center is a unique institution in the foreign policy landscape. We're congressionally chartered, we're scholarship-driven, we're fiercely independent and nonpartisan. What that really means is that while a lot of institutions deal in opinion and advocacy, we've been asked by Congress to go further into scholarship, into learning. Our currency is knowledge, our focus is independent analysis, and our purpose is developing ideas and options that decision makers can believe in, all of which makes this a perfect place for today's event. We are truly delighted to partner with the Japan-America Society of Washington for the 10th Annual Forum. As Shihoko said, but I'll say it again personally, we're really excited with this partnership. We think it's fabulous. You know, it is great to work with a society that's been enhancing ties between our nations since 1957. Just think about how far those relations have come since 1957. It's quite extraordinary. We can talk about partnerships, we can talk about alliances, but friendships, that is what is so essential and what makes all of this so special. I look forward to collaborating in the future to deepen the understanding and appreciation for that friendship. I think it goes without saying that this conference comes at a time of heightened global uncertainty, increasing expectations for Japan's leadership in the world stage. But Tokyo's commitment to multilateralism is important and it's truly noteworthy. It provides real hope for all of us and greater cooperation in tapping into the genius of Japan's economic miracle in ways that will lift lives and build communities and lift the human condition. Japan and the U.S. share core values that are crucial for good governance, for economic growth in Japan and the U.S., and quite frankly, in so many parts of the world. Tokyo is an irreplaceable ally in promoting rule of law across the South and Southeast Asia. And I think that our efforts to reach, as an American, our efforts to reach like-minded countries across the Indo-Pacific, let's face it, they can't be effective unless we're working closely with Japan. Japan has emerged in recent years as an effective bridge builder between advanced economies and the global South. And that is a crucial part of what lies ahead. This year's conference can help to highlight the strong relations that our two countries enjoy in their combined efforts to push back on authoritarianism, to promote transparency, and to advocate for greater adherence to the rule of law. And so my thoughts about how important this is, but let's get things going. I'm going to turn it over to Ryan Schaefer, the president of the Japan-America Society of Washington, who will kick off today's discussions. Ryan, welcome. Good to have you.
All right. Well, thank you so much to Ambassador Green, and thanks so much to Dr. Goto and the Wilson Center and all of your colleagues. I'm Ryan Schaefer, president of Japan America Society of Washington, D.C. Our organization is a nonprofit, nonpartisan civil society organization that promotes the U.S.-Japan relationship, and specifically the people-to-people ties that underpin its base. Our organization hosts the largest Japanese cultural event in the country, right here in Washington, D.C. That's the Sakura Matsuri Japanese Street Festival. We also host the nation's Japanese language competition, the National Japan Bowl, both every spring, and in cooperation and depending on many of you in the room and over 600 volunteers from the Washington, D.C. and National Capital Region community. This event, Japan in the Year, in this case the 2024 edition, is one of several events through the year in which we partner with colleagues in the think tank community to convene policy-centered events. And this is actually the 10th year of this program, so it's an anniversary for us, and it's really an honor to hold this anniversary event at such a prestigious and really lovely institution. So huge thanks again to Ambassador Green and Dr. Goto, and for those of you not in Washington, it is not a nice day today. So I appreciate everybody coming out and coming out early, and I don't blame you, those who are choosing to join online. Let's see, the purpose of this event, as it has been for the last 10 years, is to try to be the first off the blocks and do an early in the year event that takes a look at what is coming ahead for Japan and the U.S.-Japan relationship. We try to do this early enough that we sneak in before any major events have a chance to occur, but we've rather failed in that regard this year. Japan has put a spacecraft on the moon. Japan's ruling party has sent a senior delegation to meet with senior leaders of the United States government, and regionally, Taiwan has elected a new president. It's even snowed in Washington twice, and I've got a cold that leaves me sounding like a frog, so forgive me in advance. But most importantly, it's really important to acknowledge that the beginning of the year was quite tragic for our friends in Japan, with the earthquake in the Noto region, and then the, again, tragically related air disaster that showed the heroism of our colleagues at Japan Airlines. But the tragedy in the Noto region is ongoing. They still need our help. And so those of you in the room and those of you listening online, I encourage you to please join our community in showing support, showing empathy, but most importantly, giving money. And you can do that. I would recommend Peace Winds America has a wonderful operation that channels money to where it needs to go. And at the moment, the U.S.-Japan Foundation has a matching campaign. So your money goes a long way. So please do consider supporting that. They're going to need our help for many, many months to come, I'm afraid. To the matter at hand, we are in keeping with our traditional format for this event. We tend to divide this up into a more domestically focused and a more foreign policy focused panel, 2 panels during the day. These days, it's a little bit difficult to separate domestic and economic affairs from security, so it's a bit of a struggle, but that's the way that we're doing it. We'll have a panel 1 from about 9:45 on economic security and trade interests between the United States and Japan. We'll have a second panel that will close out the day on foreign policy and security challenges facing Japan and the United States. And we will initiate all of this with some really nice context setting. We, again, failed in our timing. We've invited both ambassadors, United States Ambassador to Japan, Emanuel, and Japan's ambassador to the United States, Shigeru Yamada, to join us, but neither were able today. But they've graciously, over the past days and in some cases hours, submitted some remarks and greetings for us, which we'll run in a moment. But before we get to that, ground rules. We have both a live and a virtual audience. So we will have a chance after our panels to ask questions and hopefully engage in a bit of back and forth. But please do, we'll have microphones going around the room, and you can state your name and your affiliation and your question and to whom you would like to direct it, bearing in mind that we'll have some of our speakers online joining from the West Coast and Tokyo, respectively. Let's see. I think that I've hit the important notes, the important ground rules. If I've forgotten anything, I'll be popping back up to the mic from time to time and remind you. But for now, we're delighted to have first a greeting from Ambassador Shigeo Yamada, who just arrived in Washington in December of this year, but it's actually his third tour through Washington, so he's an old friend to many in the room and many in the community. We're delighted to have him and really grateful that he's sent his greetings today.
On behalf of the Asia program,
Good morning. I'm Shigeo Yamada, the Japanese ambassador to the United States. I arrived in Washington, D.C. last December. In fact, I have spent more time here than in any other city in the world, except for my hometown, Tokyo. So D.C. is like my second home. I would like to thank Ambassador James Zumwalt and Mr. Ryan Schaefer of the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., as well as Ambassador Mark Green of the Wilson Center for co-hosting this annual seminar, Japan in the Year. The rock-solid foundation of our strong alliance is the trust between our two peoples, which is nurtured through a broad network of people-to-people contacts, including this seminar. I am honored to join you this year as ambassador and to look ahead to 2024. For the Japanese people, 2024 began with the rather shocking news of the Noto Peninsula earthquake. In the aftermath of this tragedy, there has been an incredible outpouring of warm messages of sympathy and offers of assistance from President Biden and many of the American people. These gestures of goodwill are deeply appreciated and serve as a sign of the strong bonds between Japan and the United States. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to touch briefly on the topics of the two panels: foreign affairs and security and economic security in the year 2024. First, I'd like to talk about foreign affairs and security. We are facing a complex international situation with challenges such as Russia's aggression in Ukraine, the situation in Gaza, and the increasingly severe security environment in East Asia. In the face of these challenges, Japan aims to uphold and strengthen the free and open international order based on the rule of law, as we emphasized at the G7 Hiroshima Summit. We should also redouble our efforts to strengthen international partnerships, including with the countries referred to as the Global South. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is an outrageous act that shakes the very foundation of the international order. If Russia is allowed to change the status quo through the use of force, the same could happen in other parts of the world. Japan remains committed to providing unwavering support to Ukraine. Regarding the situation in Gaza, we strongly condemn the terrorist attacks and stress the importance of urging all parties to act on the basis of international law. Facing these challenges, my primary task as the ambassador of Japan is to strengthen our relationship with the United States, which is Japan's only ally. The Japan-US alliance is indispensable to the peace, stability, and prosperity, not only of our two countries, but also of the international community. In this sense, the Japan-US relationship has become more than a bilateral relationship. It has evolved to be a true global partnership. Turning to the economy, Japan and the United States are also strengthening our economic relations. For 4 consecutive years, Japan has been the world's largest investor in the United States. This direct investment has created 1 million American jobs, many of them in the manufacturing sector. Today, our cooperation in economic security is growing rapidly. Using frameworks including the Japan-US Economic Policy Consultative Committee, or the Economic 2+2, we are working closely together to address today's and tomorrow's challenges, such as supply chain resilience and emerging technologies. 2024 will be a pivotal year for Japan-US relations, with an official visit by Prime Minister Kishida taking place early in the year. Foreign Minister Kamikawa already visited DC earlier this month and actively discussed various issues with her counterparts in preparation for the Prime Minister's visit. I'm sure that Prime Minister Kishida's visit will be a wonderful opportunity to demonstrate to the American people and to the international community the strength of our alliance and to take our cooperation to a new level. I will spare no effort to make it a great success. I would like to conclude today by sharing with you a personal hobby of mine. Running has been a passion of mine for many years, and I look forward to running with all of you, not in the marathon, but on the similarly long and rewarding road to an even stronger global partnership between our two countries. So thank you for your attention, and I wish you a productive and insightful seminar today.
Well, thanks to Ambassador Yamada. I'm proud to announce that as of yesterday, Ambassador Yamada has agreed to serve as an honorary patron to the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., which we were honored by and we deeply appreciate. And we look forward to joining you in making the visit of the Prime Minister in April a success. That's an exciting event for all of us. From Ambassador Yamada, we now turn to Ambassador Rahm Emanuel. We were fortunate to have Ambassador Emanuel join us last year for this event on what was precisely his first anniversary as ambassador to Japan. So that would make this precisely his second anniversary as ambassador to Japan. But Ambassador Emanuel also serves as an honorary patron to the society. And we were fortunate that Dr. Goto was able to catch up with him and conduct an interview. So we have a back and forth that took place just days ago with Ambassador Rahm Emanuel and Dr. Goto.
On behalf of the Asia program of the Wilson Center and the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., thank you so much for your time today. We're excited that you are part of the Society's annual forum on U.S.-Japan relations, which marks its 10th year this year. And so as we look ahead to the next 12 months, we know that the new year does not mean a blank slate. There are many unresolved issues in foreign policy from previous years. Yeah. And there's a whole laundry list. War in Ukraine, marking its second year next month. There's the ongoing conflict between Israel and Gaza. North Korea is becoming an even bigger threat. So the list goes on. But we see that Japan's actually emerged and continues to gain ground, not just as a leader of a free and open Indo-Pacific, but a broader global stabilizer, right? And so and Japan is really focused on multilateral cooperation, promoting the rule of law. How do you expect the United States and Japan to cooperate in providing greater stability in an increasingly uncertain world?
Well, by at every level across the spectrum, enhancing our deterrence. And when I say that, a lot of people usually think about hard power, but I think diplomacy, development, and defense all go in combination. I mean, I do believe the credibility of our deterrence. Take one thing out of the diplomatic kind of bag. Take a look at what happened at Camp David with the President of the United States, President of Korea, the Prime Minister of Japan. I mean, that was China's worst nightmare. They spent 30 years trying to make sure not the three of us never got on the same page, working in lockstep and in coordination with each other. So the credibility of your deterrence ensures working together. That I kind of define the U.S.-Japan relationship as evolving from one of alliance protection to alliance projection. And at every level, out of whether it's in the stream of defense, you're happen to be doing an interview with me the day after we did the Tomahawk signing, and 400 Tomahawks are going to be coming towards Japan. We're starting in March, accelerated schedule, the training, so technology and training going together. That to me is the things you do to establish not just deterrence, but the credibility of that deterrence. So it has a pause button on those who seek aggression, coercion, and suppression as their toolkit. And I do think that Japan, and I spoke about this yesterday at the International Press Club, because it marks the 2-year anniversary of when I came to Tokyo. As I like to joke, for the Japanese, it feels like 20 years, but I've been here only 2 years, is how quickly they have moved. Just take one example as an illustration of a bigger point. They've adopted 2% of their GDP towards defense. 20 years ago, NATO adopted that policy, and only 11 NATO countries would do it. Japan adopted that policy last year, passed a budget, implemented the policy, and already has signed a contract for probably the most significant piece of that, which is the 400 Tomahawks and counter-strike capability and the training starting in March. When you look around the world, Japan is not moving at glacial speed. A lot of the rest of the world has. Second, this is a challenge to the United States. We have to update and move at a faster pace. We have to keep up with events here in the region. And I would say, note that by, one example, we worked through last year some issues where Japan's going to relicense the Patriots that we licensed for them to produce, and they're going to increase production. But we should take a look across areas of surface ships, other equipments, other ammunition. How does Japan's industrial strength and capability and engineering capability become part of the arsenal of democracy? Not for export so much, but to work with the United States in either the development or the production of essential equipment that's part of America's inventory, like we did on the Patriot, so that while we ramp up our own industrial production, Japan is a part of that story. We don't do that. We've done it kind of episodically. We don't have a comprehensive integrated strategy. So we have to do our own kind of evaluation and be frank and honest when we look in the mirror. Are we doing everything we need to do? And on certain things, yes. And on certain things, we have to be honest and start to improve our game and not keep doing the same old thing and expect a different result.
Thank you. So you talk about deterrence. You talk about the risk of China. You've been here. You've been in Tokyo for 2 years. Over the last since your tenure as ambassador, you've not shied away from sharing your views on many things, including the challenges that China poses to international security and the global economy. I'd like to ask you about the competition and protection of advanced technology. To what extent do the United States and Japan see eye to eye on China as an economic threat? You've talked about the security threat. I'd like to ask about the economic threat of China. And what tools beyond export controls could the two countries cooperate on, and what industries, apart from semiconductors, would be conducive to greater bilateral coordination?
So one is like last night, and it's something we worked on at the G7. Let me use one example. We put together the United States University of Chicago and the University of Tokyo in a first ever partnership on quantum computing. Last night in Davos, the Seoul National University joined that partnership. And IBM and Google are backing it up, and it's a really groundbreaking research partnership with the three countries, taking the spirit of Camp David and driving it into our people to people. So there's many benefits to that. It also keeps our countries and our technology and our companies, and maybe future companies, on the cutting edge of one of the most important technologies. Now, that's one example of how do you stay ahead of the game. And we're working on that in the area of AI. We're working on that in the area of semiconductor training engineers. Purdue, with 6 universities in the United States, 4 here in Japan, making sure we add, I think, about 40,000 additional engineers that we would not have otherwise if we didn't do this consortium. Pause, let me come back to that. Now, I'm going to address this question slightly as a former chief of staff, mayor, congressman. I can't tell you how many US companies used to come into my office, whether I was chief of staff or congressman and caucus chair for the Democrats, and would complain about the way China was stealing intellectual property, complain about the economic espionage. Now, in the United States, we give you a tax write-off for that R&D. So the taxpayers are funding your research and development. And every company and every CEO that came into my office, oh, it's a real problem, but I'm worried about the Chinese market. Now, I don't blame China for using its market. I blame China for the economic espionage, for the intellectual property theft, as a part of their economic strategy. Now, I'll give you an example of that, just in the space of semiconductors. There's ASML in Netherlands. They produce really high-end machinery for semiconductors. Here in Japan is Tokyo Electron and Canon. They compete. They don't steal. Now, 4 months ago, the Dutch acknowledged there was an individual stealing blueprints from their R&D. Wasn't Tokyo Electron. Wasn't Canon. It was the Chinese. Now, you can't have an economic, integrated, international, global economy where everybody's playing by one rule of competing on price and capabilities and quality of their machines, and the other one is stealing from you and then with state subsidies undercutting your price. Now, the Koreans, Japanese, the United States, the Dutch, or other countries, Taiwan, understand that. Does it mean we agree on 100% of how to get and implement and protect our research? Every one of those products, were either companies buying across global from the Pacific or the Atlantic, research coming out of our universities, research coming out of our companies, but we don't steal. We do not steal from each other. We compete with each other. It's a really different thing. And then what we don't do is an attempt to grab market share, have the state write a check that underperforms price. That is across not just semiconductors, it's across every space. Now, you can say solar, that got away, but the real question, there's other areas that we're now trying to catch up. Japan has a very breaking technology in the solar space. About 2 weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal wrote about this new kind of non-silicon product for solar. A lot of people are looking at it. Gets you out of the supply chain of China. It's a real, it expands where you could put solar to generate energy. You think China's looking at that from wow, there's a market competitor, or how do I steal it? Now, I know how the United States is looking at it. We're willing to put resources towards it. So to me, there's a core question about the assumptions going on here. So it's not just in the semiconductors, so that's critical. But I can tell you across spectrums of different parts of the economy where they hold a core piece of kind of a critical, not only technology or critical sector that allows the rest of the economy to operate, China can be a competitor, game on, but you can't get on the field and cheat. That's where we're going to change the rules.
Mhm. Um,
And I would, yeah, I'm sorry about this because it touches on something. A classic example here in Japan. They banned all Japanese seafood because, quote unquote, the quality of the water coming out of Fukushima. And yet they're fishing in the Japanese waters for the same fish. Now, at what point, like you say in poker, who's the fool here at the table? And all I'm saying is, you can compete. You can play by a certain internet, be a global economy, very important. Really great products, got it. Great culture. You just can't cheat and steal your way to leadership. We're going to put a halt on it. And if you don't like getting called out, then you got to understand you can't be a global partner if people want to basically pull back from being robbed.
mhm. If I can go back to this issue of coercion, um, I think there has been a great deal of appreciation in Japan about your personal support and the US government's support to push back against Chinese boycott and banning of Japanese fish. Coercion.
While they continue to fish for the same fish with their fishing fleet. Not
Right.
just ban. You want to ban? You want to have a public health reason? Fine. Then take the 400 ships out of the Japanese EEZ zone. It's not just coercion. I mean, I don't have a problem if you want to protect your country's public health. Not a problem. It's the duplicity, hypocrisy of something that's part of the international system, which is respecting other countries' EEZs and their own economic security.
Is there a way for the United States and Japan to deter China from taking economic coercive action in the first place?
Dial back at the G7 in Hiroshima for the first time in the G7, economic coercion was put into the kind of communique where all the countries signed on to it. About a year ago, at Tokyo University, I issued a report out of the embassy that we developed studying, and there's better, let me also be clear, this wasn't done for peer review. There are better reports from CSIS. There's an Australian think tank on coercion that studied China's play. Looked at what happened in Korea when the THAAD was deployed. Looked at Japan when they took actions in 2012 for their own economic security. Looks at Australia when they mentioned we should review the origination of Ebola. It looked at Lithuania. It also looked at when Russia tried to use energy to coerce Europe in the beginning days of Ukraine. In each case, there's a couple common themes of how countries combated that coercion. In the end of the day, it's by partnerships and making the cost too expensive for China and or Russia because we act in unison and in protection of each other. In each case, whether that's the most recent one being Australia, after 3 years of trying to coerce Australia's behavior, basically China threw in the towel. Why? Australia's increased trade with all these other countries and realized they didn't have to be so dependent on China, and China's leverage was diminished. On the fishing area, there's a lot of exploration right now. We're working. One step was the United States Armed Forces based here started to buy Japanese fish, which we had not done before. Why? I couldn't tell you how that started. But we started to do that. Now, the U.S. Armed Forces is not going to beat the Chinese market, but it starts to show a new market that Japan didn't have. Second, from kind of a handling, just take scallops for an example as a product, shell versus etc. Another distribution model and another operation in both Vietnam, the Philippines, Mexico, that gives Japan a route outside of their scallops from Japan going to China, and then China re-exporting them to the United States. So over the marathon race, showing that Japan has other ways of handling it is how you beat that coercion. And acting in unison with your other trading partners, stepping in to help some country Take the case of Lithuania. Their position on Taiwan, because they were part of the EU, China's coercion fell flat on its face. Because Australia had economic trading partners with others, China's coercion basically wrapped it up, walked off the field. So that's how you beat coercion. The United States, when it came to Europe's energy needs, led an effort, and 2 winters, Russia's coercion fell flat on its face. So that's, to me, how you beat this coercion. And China's trying to do what's in China's interest, but nobody should ever be in a position where they're dependent on China or Russia as an economic trading partner, as if they're going to play on a level playing field. So that said, if that's what they're going to do, you have to look at products before the problem comes, and when the problem comes, how to work in unison with like-minded nations, as the president has led.
Thank you. Ambassador Emanuel, I would very much like to continue this conversation, ask you
So would
more
I.
about
I
economic
love looking at your
security.
back. I love looking at your background.
And actually, I wanted to ask you about your meeting with Shohei Ohtani, and issuing that visa for his dog.
I don't think he would call it a meeting. I would say, I'll give you one joke. So he gave the dog its visa. He gave me a jersey. It's signed by State Department, by State Department rules. You're not allowed to take a gift over $20. If you think I'm ever going to tell the State Department I got that jersey signed, not a chance.
No. And then your secret is safe with us. So as we wait for our third panelist who's joining virtually, Saori Katada from California, from USC, it's actually very interesting for those of us who cover economic issues in Washington. When we have a day-long forum, traditionally pre-pandemic, economic issues had always been at the end of the day, and so you would have a full room, and we'd go for the hot topics on foreign affairs, security issues, and at the end, the room would actually be almost like completely empty, and the panelists would be talking just among themselves. But obviously, that is no longer the case. Economic issues are now strongly intertwined with security issues, and the interest of economic security issues as well as trade relations is very apparent. And we are leading this conversation too on the topic of economic security and trade. So when we look at US-Japan relations, trade is no longer the source of friction that it had once been. The two countries share economic interests, which again overlap with national security concerns as well as economic concern. They're united on adhering to the rule of law and economic engagement in particular. They're focused on building up resilience to disruptions. They're both also focused on promoting sustainable growth within and beyond their borders as well. And these issues have brought the two countries closer together. There is not as much focus on trade imbalances, but that said, our goal today is to talk about not just the opportunities, but also, quite frankly, the risks ahead and tensions between the two sides. And so I'm hoping that in our conversation today, over the course of the next hour, we can be frank, as friends can be, and talk about some of the sources of friction, including the rise of protectionism, growth of industrial policy, political interests often overshadowing economic goals, and look into how this will impact trade relations and the future of economic security goals between the two countries. It's a big topic, but I am thrilled that we have three amazing speakers joining us today. First, online is Saori Katada, who is the Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for International Relations at the University of Southern California. She's also the author of Japan's New Regional Reality, Geoeconomic Strategy in the Asia-Pacific. It is a must-read if you haven't read it already. I am joined here today to my immediate left with Kotaro Shiojiri, who is the Wilson Center's inaugural Japan Foundation Visiting Fellow. He is a former seasoned diplomat with the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and during his time at the Wilson Center, he joined us in September. His research focuses precisely on economic security and U.S.-Japan relations. And then finally, we have David Bowling, who is the Director for Japan and Asia Trade with the Eurasia Group. He is a former negotiator at USTR, and he was deeply involved with the U.S.-Japan trade agreement and Japan-related provisions with the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So with that, perhaps I could turn first to you, Saudi. Our goal here is to talk about the trade priorities of the two countries. I would like you to focus on what Japan's priorities may be regarding trade relations with the United States moving forward. And where are the pitfalls?
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and greetings from Los Angeles. I'm sorry I cannot be there in person. It's an honor to be a part of this wonderful 10th annual Japan of the Year event. Thank you to Wilson Center and Japan America Society of Washington for inviting me. I would like to put the, context for this panel to talk much more about the U.S.-Japan trade relationship, looking from Japan's side. Just kind of looking at year 2024, this is critical year in various ways. Obviously, as mentioned earlier, the geopolitics conflict continues with Ukraine, as well as the conflict in Gaza. All of them contribute significantly to impact supply chain logistics, as well as energy and food security. So all that is a critical crisis that will bound to continue for some time into the future. Also, this is a year where 70 plus countries will have elections, obviously, including the one in the United States, and this will impact the global economic governance quite significantly. And another concerning feature of 2024 is the direction of the Chinese economy itself, and this will affect the global economy in multiple ways. So given that context, Japan is also facing various critical elements going into 2024. Well, currently we are in 2024. One thing that you might be reading from the news is so-called the 2024 problem. This is quite domestic in nature, but due to the changes in the Labor Standard Act, which limits the amount of overtime for workers starting this April, the way that will affect various essential workers, such as the truck drivers or nursing care workers, would have a major impact or fear to have major impact on the Japanese economy. Continuing weak yen, obviously, worries Japan. It's kind of interesting. We are very used to Japanese people and the businesses like having weak yen. But now there's a realization of the weakness that it brings to Japanese economy, as well as along with the inflation that's going on, especially of food and energy, that concern is sticking in Japanese people's mind. And finally, obviously this is not an economic issue, but ongoing slush fund crisis going on in the Japanese political setting, the financial law, the political finance law, etc., is having an effect on the Kishida government. Some of the major figures, like ministers and chief cabinet secretary, have to resign, and having a new set of leaders in Japan. So altogether, this is a challenging year, starting obviously with the major earthquake in Noto 2. So in the next few minutes, what I'd like to do is to put Japan-US trade relations and its the recent past into future in 3 buckets. This is obviously US-Japan in relations is one of the very important component of global economic governance or trade governance. And US-Japan sees some convergence, but not all of them. So let me put it in 3 buckets in the order of the higher convergence to lower. So the first one that I see really important in the US-Japan trade relations or economic relations a bit broadly is to use their own resources for the green and digital economy transition, especially in support of the global south. And I think we've seen quite a significant conversion in here in the agreement in IPEF, in Clean Economy Pillar, where US and Japan, along with Australia, is contributing significant funds for decarbonization. And there is the kind of keen, Japan is very keen, where they agree to promote hydrogen energy utilizing Japan's advanced technology. On the other hand, there's a bit of a concern where Japan struggles in terms of energy transition that was demonstrated in the kind of maybe not disagreement, but a bit of a distance at the Hiroshima G7 last year, where Japan wants to take omnidirectional approach when it comes to energy supply, and also the kind of promote the various pathways to reach decarbonization for developing countries, which is not fully agreed by others, especially including the United States. The second bucket is the supply chain and supply chain resilience. I think there are significant convergence, as you can see from the IPEF the pillar on the supply chain has been agreed, accelerated pace in May last year. That was the first one to be agreed. There has been a bilateral agreement in the critical mineral agreement last May, as well as a significant conversion in the critical and energy technology supply chain, whereas many agreements were reached, especially in the context of economic 2+2. Japan has been highly cooperative in friend-shoring, ally shoring of technology, especially related to semiconductor. And Japan is also on its own put in place the economic security promotion law that will be protecting the supply chain resilience. Altogether, this is the good news, but there is a significant kind of pushback, significant concern in terms of slow reshoring effort on the part of Japanese businesses. Obviously, the change in the Chinese economic situation will affect that. And because the businesses are worried about the government forcing some of the effort that they are slowly making, but try to accelerate it. The third pillar, which I think is most important, but the slow going between the US and Japan, is the maintenance of the rule-based economic order in the global trade. And this is most important in terms of US-Japan partnership. 3 pillars of IPEF has reached agreement in November, but obviously, as everybody knows, that probably the most significant pillar of trade was not agreed. And this one, so maybe put the good news first. The agreement about economic coercion based on the Hiroshima G7 and Paris Agreement later on is now moving its way in the US, I guess the US Congress, if I understand it correctly, like as a Counter Economic Coercion Act, things like that. But still, the concern here is that trade pillar in IPEF was not agreed, especially when it comes to digital trade. And Japan is now pushing its signature digital free flow with trust process to the through OECD, and also Japan is hoping for other ways to strengthen that. Last thing that the very thing that Japan has always asked US to do is to come back to TPP and more support on WTO, all of which doesn't seem to be happening anytime soon. So just to wrap up, this is a very critical time for Japan and US to work together. What Japan ultimately wants in a trade and economic relationship with the US is that US continues to be an active trading nation, first of all, and engaging with the rest of the world to work together as a trading nation to protect rule-based order. Thank you.
So you've given us a great overview of what to look out for and where Japan's key interests are regarding its own trade agenda. And I think describing this as trading nation, Japan is very much at the forefront of trading nations, and I think that is a sentiment, that is a belief that's actually shared across the Indo-Pacific. But let me turn to David now and have him discuss some of the concerns and expectations for the United States and its trade agenda, expectations for Japan, for the United States to achieve some of its trade goals, including the protection of advanced technologies through various mechanisms, and where the opportunities for greater cooperation and where some of the challenges may be in bilateral relations.
Thank you, Chihoko, and thank you, Ryan, for inviting me to be on this panel. It's a big celebration, and I'm glad to be able to participate in it. One brief note about where I work. I work at Eurasia Group, and I'd just like to point out, we're not a think tank. We're not like Wilson Center. We're also not a government relations group. Basically, what we do is political risk analysis, and our clients, we advise them on making decisions that involve political risk about how to basically make business decisions. So I just wanted to highlight that fact. That's sort of my vantage point, and my vantage point of having worked at USTR for 7 years. So what I'd like to focus on, yes, is U.S. trade policy and how I see Japan fitting in that. My overarching theme here is that the United States has changed when it comes to trade, and we've gone from being a proponent of free trade to being a proponent of what I call secure trade. So what's the traditional free trade consensus that no longer exists? It was all about opening foreign markets to exports. It was about promoting economic efficiency. It was about promoting consumer welfare. And what that involved was a very sort of outbound focus, a focus on knocking down trade barriers in foreign countries, knocking down tariffs, knocking down non-tariff barriers, basically trying to make foreign markets look more like the United States, right? That we wanted foreign markets to have high intellectual property protection, or wanted it to be an open investment regime. And there was a coalition in Congress that generally agreed with that. It was free trade Republicans and moderate Democrats, and that's how you got a free trade agreement through. You could really never rely on the progressive Democrats or organized labor to support a free trade agreement during that time. But that was the coalition. That's not in fashion right now. I think it started to crumble in 2015 when TPP was starting to get a lot of opposition from Congress. And then, of course, President Trump pulled the plug on TPP, and there you have it. So what's this new trade consensus? Some people call it the Washington consensus. What I call it is, as I said, the secure trade consensus. It's really about national and economic security. That's number one. National security in my view right now is varsity, and trade is junior varsity. And trade is subservient to national security and economic security interests these days. It's focused on, as we were hearing earlier, on security and resiliency, more producer and worker focused. It's very inbound focused. For example, we talk about these terms nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. And what's this all in reaction to? China. I mean, China's the big problem here, right? And it's the catalyst for why U.S. trade policy really changed. I think there's a feeling in Washington, D.C. that, hey, we gave China a chance. We brought them into the WTO, and then they started to change direction, and we have to react to that, and we're behind. And that's a lot of the urgency right now. For example, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, years ago, that was kind of a backwater in trade policy. Didn't seem to do much. Now it's really important. Whole law firms have built up new practices on CFIUS, right? That's one big change. Of course, Nippon Steel, U.S. Steel deal, that's implicated there too. The other is the role of tariffs. Trump affirmatively, actively, he was Mr. Tariff Man, used tariffs against China. The Biden administration hasn't taken those tariffs away. They have not added new tariffs, but they have not taken those tariffs away. So tariffs remain important. And I think it's important to recognize the increased clout of organized labor. A lot of this is due to our presidential election cycle in the key states, which are, of course, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Also, the Biden administration, their whole trade policy is called the worker-centered trade policy. I think this might be a bit of an exaggeration, but I'll say it anyway. I think labor pretty much has a veto these days when it comes to U.S. trade policy. And the interesting thing was the labor unions were really in sync with the Trump administration on trade. The labor unions loved Trump when it came to trade. They disagreed with him on everything else, but when it came to trade, there were two peas in a pod, really the same, and they looked at the world the same way. There is an outbound focus to this new trade agenda, but it's focused on what we're sending out and trying to control it. It's not about opening foreign markets. It's about outbound investment rules. It's about export controls. What we're sending, particularly to China, that's the real focus of U.S. trade policy. It has an industrial policy element. We're very interested in electric vehicles these days, how to support it, semiconductors. This makes the Commerce Department much more of a lead when it comes to U.S. trade policy. Where I used to work, U.S. trade representative, honestly is much more diminished because we're not out there negotiating trade agreements anymore. And then finally, I would say there's a new political consensus. There is really no interest right now in the Biden administration or in Congress on opening foreign markets. There's no interest in having trade promotion authority brought back. Biden's not pushing for it. Congress is not interested in it. And there's this new coalition. You don't hear the word free trade in Washington, D.C. much. Do you hear any free trade, anyone in the Republican Party talking about being free trade? They're not. That's gone. So you've lost the free trade Republicans. The progressive Democrats and organized labor oppose an active trade agenda. So all you have is some moderates, so nothing's happening on trade from that standpoint. Now, how does Japan fit into all this? The good news is actually I think the U.S. and Japan agree a lot on trade these days because we have this common concern of China. Japan is a key ally in how we deal with China on both national security and economic security. I think Washington, D.C. really gets that. I think Japan and the United States are in sync on some of this when it comes to nearshoring, friendshoring, onshoring. The reaction to China is critical for Japan. I think Japan's always going to be a bit more nuanced when it comes to trade with China because China's their number one trade partner. Export controls, the Japanese came along with the U.S. export controls. Investment screening law. Japan revised its investment screening law a few years ago. It never mentions China, but that was all about China. The economic security law that was recently passed never mentions China, but it was all about China. We all know it. Industrial policy, Japan's interested in electric vehicles, semiconductors. Where we are out of sync with Japan is on the use of tariffs. We're much more willing to use tariffs than Japan. The other thing that we're out of sync on with Japan, I think, is the role of labor and organized labor. Organized labor has a lot of influence on U.S. trade policy. Organized labor doesn't have any influence, as far as I can tell, on trade policy in Japan. Historically, it had been agriculture, but agriculture's power is diminished. So Japan has been a leader on CPTPP, RCEP, a new EU agreement that they passed several years ago. Japan, of course, wants us to come back to CPTPP. It's not going to happen. It's impossible. You have to change the agreement if you want the United States to come back. The United States is not going to come back just for geopolitical reasons. That is, as a counterweight to China. That's the way Congress sees things. And I think Japan has a lot more hesitancy when it comes to outbound investment rules. So that's the way I see U.S. trade policy, and that's the way I see Japan fitting in with U.S. trade policy right now.
Great. Thank you. David, that was, you covered a lot of ground there. Before I turn to Kotaro, I would like to remind those who are joining us online that we are taking questions. There is a chat box below the screens that you have, so please submit your questions. Kotaro, over to you. Japan has been at the forefront of establishing, looking at economic security in a very comprehensive way. I'm hoping you could update us on that and where prospects for U.S.-Japan alignment in working together and expanding that economic security partnership beyond the two countries.
Thank you, Shihoko, and thank you, Ryan, for inviting me for this panel. And it's great to be back in D.C. And I was a former Minister of Foreign Affairs official, but no longer an official. So I just want to put out a disclaimer that what I will say is not the government's point of view. This is my individual point of view, although no one sees me as a government official anymore. But having said that, let me step back a little and talk about my understanding of economic security policy, which is aligned with Japanese government's understanding, as well as U.S. government understanding of the economic security policy, which I believe so. First and foremost, I think academically you have to make a definition of economic security, but here I do not want to waste too much time on it, and we'll just say that it's a linkage between economy and security, and we can have a discussion about it later about it as well. But having said that, I think there are four aspects, very basic aspects of economic security. One is to know, second is to protect, third is to promote, and fourth is to partner. And let me strike down one of the elements one by one. First one is to know. In order to have an efficient and effective economic security policy, I think you have to know what your supply chains are. And the other panelists have already mentioned the importance of this, but this already poses a lot of difficulties because the data is with the industry, with the private sector, and those information not necessarily are shared with the government for various reasons. And here we can say that private-public partnership is already very important. Number two is to protect. Obviously, in order to protect the leakage, to prevent the leakage of information, technology, cutting-edge technology, and other materials are important. Export control measures, investment control measures are part of this. Number three is promotion. Some of us already mentioned but to have a promotion of R&D, promotion of development of critical technology and goods are important, and this is sort of an offensive policy compared to the second pillar, which is the defensive policy. Quickly moving forward to the fourth pillar that I think is important is to partner, which comes into play with the IPEF agreement that the other panelists has already mentioned and other partnership, because the supply chain is so global now that we have to partner with others, and not a single country, industry, or company can deal with it. Having said that, there are two major struggles, I believe, which I already mentioned. One point is the private-public partnership. When we talk about economic security policy, we tend to think about the government perspective, national security. But the real sacrifice is done in the industry part, and we have to know what the data is from the industry part, and I think we need to partner with them. So I think having the government point of view is important, but also the industry point of view, private sector point of view is important. I think that is a new boundary that we're going into in terms of economic security policy. And the second struggle, or the important point, already David mentioned already, but it's the balance between free trade and national security. My PhD dissertation was about Article 21 of the GATT 1994, which is at the crossroad of economy and security. This article is very ambiguous, but this ambiguity can harm the industry, which are not sure if what policies are WTO compatible or not, and we can have the discussion later on. These four pillars and two struggles, I think these are exactly the ones that Japan and US are dealing with and struggling with. First and foremost, Japan. As Chihoko mentioned, I think Japan is a forerunner in terms of these efforts, having facing China's economic coercion, some people say in 2010 about rare earth, and having developed some of the policies related to that. Economic Security Promotion Act, enacted in May 2022, is one of those efforts, and it has multiple pillars, but some of those are supply chains, critical infrastructure, technology cooperation with private sector, as I mentioned, with the struggle, and number four is the keeping patent application non-public to some extent. So these aligns with what I mentioned for the four pillars and two struggles, and which also aligns with the U.S. efforts as well, which I will not go into detail, but has included Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and so on. Let me quickly move on to the U.S.-Japan cooperation, which I believe that the other panels has mentioned already, so we'll not repeat it too much. But I think we are mostly on the same page. For example, 2021 April core partnership establishment, 2022 January Economic 2+2 that Ambassador Yamada has mentioned earlier, and we already had two meetings already. And I think a lot of things are mentioned on that, and I think we can see the common topics that we are working on, including competition and innovation, including cybersecurity, space and semiconductor, global health, climate change, and clean energy, and so on. And other cooperation can be seen with the IPEF, Quad, and U.S.-Japan ROK relations as well, and the list of cooperation goes on and on. So I think the fact is that we are aligned in many fields, and that there are a lot to do, but a lot are done, but we are still doing a lot, and it needs to develop. And as Ambassador Yamada said already, it's sort of a marathon. We have to keep on doing more and more. So if I could close my opening statement by some of the gaps that you want us to focus on the discussion probably. I think there are three major gaps. One is China, how we deal with China. You mentioned, David, you mentioned already some of the nuances that Japan has, which is a little bit different from the US. Second point is the domestic industrial policy, which relates to some of the investment issues with the US Steel and whatnot, and we can discuss about that. And I think the third one is unilateralism between and versus multilateralism, which already has mentioned again. So I think that is what I wanted to say, and looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, Kotaro, and thank you both, all three of you, for your opening comments to get this conversation going. Full disclosure, as I solicit questions from our online participants, you'll see me looking at my phone. It's not because I'm bored, it's simply because I'm trying to keep, and I'm so sorry if I appear rude and constantly refreshing my screen. Anyway, so we are getting a few questions about China, and David, you said that Japan and the United States have a common concern regarding China, and at the same time, Kotaro, you also pointed out that there are perhaps some differences in how we approach this. Let me first turn to Saori to elaborate where Japan and the United States may not necessarily see eye to eye when it comes to dealing with the China challenge and mitigating some of the risks that Chinese coercion in particular may face. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. So my apologies. Actually, there was a technical glitch that I couldn't hear half of what David said. Well, the second half of what David said and first half of what Kotaro said. So I apologize if I'm repeating something. I'm a bit off key from the conversation. But between about the difference between U.S. and Japan regarding China, I have written a couple of chapters on a book volume on the CPTPP related to China, Japan's take on China. So what Japan wants is to have China kind of be part of the network in some ways, but have China controlled so that obviously it doesn't abuse or weaponize economic interdependence or use economic coercion and abide by the rules. I think there is some sense that the fact that China wanted and now applied to join CPTPP back in September 2021 demonstrate that there are some within China that, one, benefit significantly from globalization and its place in the global economy, but two, are really wanting to reform China, not necessarily politically, but definitely on economic terms. So containing China or getting China isolated is the last thing Japan wants to do. And obviously, as I think I quote Kotaro's last part, many of the industries are still counting on the population and the consumer in China, if it's not just for not for the production, but also for the sales and for the market. So altogether, that kind of Japan wants to keep this balanced approach vis-a-vis China, while if the when US pushes strongly to contain and isolate China, that becomes worrisome thing for Japan. Thank you.
Great. Either of you?
Sure. Well, first of all, Saori, I think my wife would like to have that kind of explanation of a technical glitch that she couldn't hear me for the last. What I would say on China is Japan has a bit of a split personality, in my view, when it comes to China. And if you look back at the G7 summit in Hiroshima and the statements that came out of that, I think it shows that. The G7 joint statement, if you look at it carefully, China is mentioned pretty far in, but China is mentioned directly, and it calls out China when it comes to the South China Seas. It calls out China when it comes to Taiwan and other security issues about China, trying to change the status quo. That's Japanese language, and I could see the influence of Japan in that part of the G7 statement. The statement, though, that came out on economic coercion and economic resiliency, as I recall, that's all about China, or a lot of that's about China, but China, again, is not mentioned. So that was interesting to me, as an example of how Japan is trying to balance here, right? Then when it comes to national security, after Russia invaded Ukraine, it was like an alarm bell went off in Tokyo. It's like a Netflix series or something. The first episode, Russia invades Ukraine. Second episode, China invades Taiwan. Japan became much more aggressive, I think, in calling out China. But because China is such an important trade partner to Japan and such a close neighbor, they're trying to strike this balance when it comes to the economic and trade side.
Yeah, if I could chime in and say that I agree for the both comments, but in terms of the Japanese national security strategy, I think we mentioned that Russia, China, and North Korea are the three major threats that we have for the security. So China is mentioned in that part, but I agree that for the economic reasons, we are having nuanced attitude towards China. And maybe I could add on to that in your comment about the split personality. I think certainly Japan, I think, has, but probably U.S. does have it as well, because U.S. also enjoys some of the economic friendship with China, and can you cut it off completely? That is also some argument. And having the election in mind, I think it is hard to be too friendly to China, but I think U.S. also has that struggle which is shared with the Japan community as well.
Thank you. So, Kotaro, you talked about the need to enhance private-public partnerships and the role that the private sector actually plays in defining trade goals moving forward, especially in advanced technology areas. How do we incorporate the views and opinions and needs of the private sector? There has been a traditional approach to this. Here in Washington, we have a very robust lobbying industry, and what we are seeing now is that certainly the law firms are very engaged in making sure that the implementation and adherence to some of the legislations, many rapid legislations that are happening, are being that companies are in compliance. What are some best practices? What would you suggest so that the private sector view is more reflected in some of the trade negotiations or in trade interests that are being articulated today?
That is a very difficult question, and I probably don't have the right answer to it. But I think the acknowledgement of the problem and how Japan was not doing that very well is being acknowledged, and there are some efforts put into this. And I think one of it, which is articulated in the Economic Security Protection Act, enacted in May 2022. And one of the pillars, as I mentioned, is the technology cooperation with private sector, which is the most important part of the act. So I think the continuous conversation with the industry is most important. From my experience as a Minister of Foreign Affairs diplomat, we didn't really have an interaction with industry, which was the METI strength, Minister of Economy, Trade, and Industry, and probably having a more of a holistic approach, not only the Ministry of Foreign Affairs being forefront of the diplomacy, but METI also playing a role. And I think in terms of those intergovernmental coordination, one of the best practices that we can have. And something that is unique about Japan is that we have not only different ministries working on economic security separately, but we also have a Council for the Promotion of Economic Security, Office for the Promotion of Economic Security and other cabinet office, which is directly under the direction of the Prime Minister's office. So I think that sort of institutionalization of the economic security policy is some of the things that could be set as a best practice. Having said that, those offices are, the officials are seconded by different ministries, so there are some kind of discussions going on as a bureaucracy in those offices, but that is the thing that I wanted to mention in terms of industry cooperation and also cooperation within the government as well.
Well, at USTR, we frequently interacted with the private sector because they have a lot of the expertise. But I would highlight it can create controversy, right, about the openness of trade policy. And I would point out that the U.S. government's interaction with big digital companies was a key factor that led to the trade pillar and IPEF collapsing, because Senator Warren sent a letter in the summertime to USTR complaining about USTR's interaction with so-called big tech companies, and that they were writing rules that were going to benefit big tech. And she didn't like this. And that became a controversy. And I think that was some of the momentum that led to the trade pillar collapsing, about a month before the meeting. So it's not easy. And there are folks who are definitely going to scrutinize that.
If I can chime in?
Yes. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I think, and I agree with Kotaro that Japan has had kind of a long tradition of the ministry working with the industries. While I think the change in terms of the ministerial kind of arrangement is that they are now within the ministries coordinated, and there's a coordinated effort under the cabinet, and all that is one step in more advancing that level of collaboration among the government, within the government, first of all, and with the industry. Having said that, I feel like Japanese government is good at providing carrots, but probably not sticks. And I think the Japanese industries are very reluctant to be exposed to sticks, which the United States government is not quite ready to do or is equipped to do. So in some ways, like the COVID supply chain subsidies that was doled out during the COVID time, there were so many subscriptions or the applications for that type of subsidies so that Japan can reshore many of these PPEs, I guess that was called, back to Japan, and things like that. Meanwhile, when it comes to penalty of violating some of these rules, the industries are very, very strongly push back against it. So maybe that's the kind of characteristics of Japanese way of dealing this private and public and private partnership.
Thanks. I want to turn to some of the trade realities today, and we talk about economic security, but at the same time, we're also seeing the rise of traditional trade concerns, the kind of concerns that you were talking about, David. Japan's exports are growing. The weak yen is to the benefit of Japan. We are seeing the growth of economic nationalism, both, especially here in the United States, in a very contested political year. What are the prospects of a return to the kind of trade friction that we had seen in the past?
I mean, with Japan, I still see it as pretty low, because I feel like Japan and the United States look at the world of trade mainly through the same lens right now. And a lot of that's because of the rise of China, right? And that's brought us together. And then also, I think the broader relationship, and I'm sure the second panel will talk about this, the broader relationship between the United States and Japan is as good as it's ever been. I mean, Japan's increasing its defense spending to 2% of GDP. They were tough on Russian sanctions. I don't think we expected that when Russia invaded Ukraine. South Korea relations are good. The Quad, the free and open Indo-Pacific, so much is really strong between the United States and Japan right now. I can say that in my view, when I was at USTR, it was mainly about sort of managing frictions. The one that's on the horizon right now that brings back memories of the 1980s and 1990s is Nippon Steel's proposed purchase of U.S. Steel, right? That's getting some attention. That will have the CFIUS review that will start. I have to say that I think the White House probably, when that was announced, thought, well, we really didn't need that Christmas present from Japan, right? It came out in mid-December. That it's a real tricky issue for the Biden administration, and it goes back to my point about the importance of organized labor in those key presidential battleground states, right? And the steelworkers are against this deal. Biden has been very close to labor and wants to remain close. I mean, that is a constituency that both Trump and Biden are vying for. So that's a tricky one. I don't think anyone who really looks at this feels like Japan is a national security threat under CFIUS, but the politics are not good. I mean, the timing, as they say, you know, in love and in politics, timing is everything. And the timing of that is awful. So that's a potential friction point that I see developing in 2024.
Saudi or Koto, do you want to chime in on
Yeah,
US
maybe
deal?
a very brief comment. I do agree and 100%, and that we need to look at the domestic industrial policies and domestic elections as well, both on the U.S. side and Japan side. But I think some of the issues that has come up with is the labor, but also business and human rights is also some of the points that was not mentioned, but I wanted to throw that element as well.
Just to add, I guess in some ways, I agree with both of them that the U.S.-Japan trade conflict that we used to see in the 1980s, 1990s is not going to come back. I mean, as I said earlier in my comment that, you know, cheap yen is great for exports, but nowadays there's some concern on the part of Japan how that is affecting Japan overall. So that's one. But two, there's the other side of this trade relationship, which is the financial side, where Japan is the largest purchaser of the treasury bills, and that's kind of sustaining, in some ways, the U.S. borrowing capacity. So that might be another thing that put these two together and as very important partners.
Right. Okay, so you've all been very patient. There are microphones. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you. Okay. If we could, Matthew, if we could. Oh, maybe yes, on that side. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Ken Scabe, Marubeni Corporation. So the panel has already mentioned the G7 and also economic coalition. However, I want to ask about very specific provision like in G7 statement last year. So the G7 decided to establish the coordination platform on economic coalition. But I have not seen any development about this one, and so I want to ask whether panelists are seeing or expecting any development on this one, and are you expecting any development in 2024 under the Italy's government? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in. Not that I have enough information to answer your question, but my first posting at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was at the G8 then and G20 summit office, and I think that the way it works is that when you're at the chair of the G7 summit, you establish those working groups and initiatives, and then Japan's personality or character is to try to follow up as much as you can. Although the chairmanship will turn to the next country, which is Italy for this year. So I do believe that there are some efforts going on in terms of the development of that area. But not that I have any specific information about that. And maybe we can ask Prime Minister Kishida when he comes to DC.
We'll give him a call. So, did you want to add, or?
Yeah, I think there are efforts in Europe. I think they are setting up certain agreement among the G7 members within Europe. And I mentioned, and I know those people who are within the inside the Beltway could probably tell me more. But there is some legislation kind of going through the process about the counter economic coercion. So independently in various parts of the world, things are moving forward, but very slowly. Am I understanding it correctly? I don't know if I'm giving any answer to it, but these are the things I've been hearing here and there.
I mean, I would add, well, Japan certainly knows a lot about economic coercion because it experienced it, I think it was one of the first to experience it in 2010 in response to the dust-up around the Senkaku Islands when China put the restrictions on rare earth elements, right? And I think ever since then, Japan's been sort of a leader in this field. And then so many other countries have been victims of China's economic coercion, whether it be Norway or Lithuania. Of course, we have Japan. There are others. What's interesting to me is the current ban that China has on Japan when it comes to seafood imports. And when that developed, I wondered, okay, how are we going to characterize this? Is this economic coercion? I think there's an argument that it is. And I don't know, but I would expect there have been some discussions among the G7 countries about, okay, we have this statement on economic coercion. This seems like a pretty good example. Are we going to do anything? And haven't really seen anything done yet. I know that when Xi Jinping and Kishida met in November, they decided to set up a scientific experts group to look into this issue. And so we'll see how that's resolved. But, you know, to me, that's a pretty good example of economic coercion, probably. And I'll be curious to see how it's handled.
Yes, the gentleman here.
Thank you. This is a great panel. I'm curious, sort of from
If you could name and affiliation.
Sure, yes. Sorry. Evan Wright with the Center for New American Security. So I'm curious about the trilateral angle on this when we're looking at U.S.-Japan trade, economic security. Shioko, I think you actually mentioned this before, but the idea of the early warning system that they've mentioned in the Camp David agenda. I've heard some ideas of it being maybe something like an economic Article 5, right? This idea of whether or not that would actually work, whether this is feasible. I'd just be curious what the panelists' reactions are in terms of both how this fits into the trilateral agenda as well as sort of any reactions to this early warning system idea. Thank you.
Saudi, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I really haven't looked into it. Really can't have anything intelligent to say, so I'll give the floor to other panelists.
All right.
I could speak just very generally about, wow, it's really amazing how much better Japanese-South Korean relations improved over 2023. And we need to remember that the fact that Camp David was able to occur so quickly and so soon in 2023 is really remarkable. I give a lot of the credit to Yoon because I think he really stuck to his promise when he campaigned. He wanted a more pro-Japan policy. And it was not easy. His poll numbers have plummeted. I also give credit to Kishida for being able to move closer to Japan. So it really is remarkable that they've come together. I don't have any specifics on that, but I do know that there's a tremendous amount of activity going on right now in the United States government as follow-up to the Camp David meeting. So we may not be seeing a lot of it, but I know from my conversations that this is really a high priority for the U.S. government. So on your specific question, I expect there are discussions going on about how to set that type of early warning system up.
Yeah, I agree with David, and ROK is one of the countries that have developed their economic security policy as well as Japan, and I think they have the National Strategic Technology Nurture Plan, which was established in 2022. So I think these three countries tagging up is a positive move, and as you said, we look forward to looking more concrete ideas. And going back to Abe-san's question, I just wanted to mention that G7 trade ministers meeting in Osaka, Sakai in October 2023, they had some statement about economic coercion and whatnot. So I think it's still at the early stage of making further development, but there are some conversations going on.
We have time for one more question. The lady here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Emma Zach. I'm an undergraduate at American University. I'm a freshman. And my question is, how will Japan continue to resolve inflation and other economic problems this year while also holding to their promises of environmental sustainability? And then one of you mentioned specifically investments in hydrogen. What are those investments specifically, if you know, and are they also investing in other forms of sustainable energy that have more research and development done, or are they specifically focusing on hydrogen? Thank you.
So,
I think she.
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, so
Yes.
since I'm not an environmental specialist, but I let me just talk about the inflation issue and somewhat related to other issues that require some government funding. I work on monetary issues here and there, and inflation, at this point, Japan really wanted inflation for a while now, and kind of inflation itself is kind of a mixed blessing. Now there is a significant shock from the Japanese public that inflation is now setting into Japan. 3-4% has never been seen for the last 30 years. So the Bank of Japan is debating, and every month when they meet, there's a speculation whether or not they will change the negative interest rate to positive and start raising rate at least somewhat. But the problem is that Japanese government is heavily indebted, 260% of GDP, and low interest rate on the part of and set by the Bank of Japan is actually make it sustainable, while it's not easy to do. So all this is connected to what the Japanese government can do in terms of its fiscal kind of outlays in supply and kind of supporting the supply chains and all that. So it's a much bigger story than just the kind of inflation. There is a significant connection to the government's strategy that it can implement with many of these funding attached to it.
Again, on inflation, it's been a big problem for Kishida, right? Because the weak yen combined with Japan's heavily reliance on energy imports and food imports has made the Japanese public very grumpy. And they're not used to inflation, right? They're used to deflation. And so it really became a political issue for him. And I think if you look at polls, about from midsummer last year, they just start going down. And then, of course, in November, December, they went down further because of the whole political finance controversy. All I can say, I'm not an energy expert, I'm sorry, is that my impression is that the environmental community is upset with Japan because they're trying to take carbon out of energy sources. They're not trying to end using carbon, fossil fuels, and that they want to see Japan be more ambitious and just like move towards renewables and to stop using fossil fuels, whereas Japan's interested in taking the carbon out through things like hydrogen and others. But I would defer to others who may be more experts in that field.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, but it is a very difficult task, and there's no simple answer to that, I believe. And Kishida doesn't have Abenomics, but he does have some policy packages that for economy, and climate change, clean energy is one of the pillars of economic 2+2 between U.S. and Japan. So hydrogen, ammonia, and other cutting-edge clean energy technology, I think it is difficult to see the future, but there's some hope to that, and I think there is investment going on in terms of R&D and development in this field as well.
Okay. On that note of optimism, I would like to conclude this conversation. Thank you, David. Thank you, Kotaro, and thank you so much, Saori, for joining us despite the time difference. Thank you for being here. And so we're going to move on to the rest of our program. But if you could all join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.
All right. right. Well, thanks again to Ambassador Emanuel and especially to Dr. Goto. I think interviewing Ambassador Emanuel is not for the faint of heart. But the output is valuable and really enlightening. So I'm delighted that he was able to share his time with us. Frankly, I'm not sure his secret is safe with us, to be honest. But at this point, let me invite up our second panel for the day, which Frank Januzzi and Grace Park, but also we have Miyako Nakabayashi, hopefully still awake. It's tomorrow for her in Tokyo, so it's late for Dr. Nakabayashi. And I think I'm going to follow Shihoko's lead, and there's Nakabayashi Sensei. Can you hear us? The evidence suggests not. Okay, well, I'm going to go out of order in my introductions in that case and start with Grace Park, who we're delighted to have with us. I think the last panel reminded us, and as Dr. Goto mentioned at the outset, it's really unusual if you put yourself back 5 years ago or 10 years ago that you would start a program like this focusing on economy and trade. But I feel like we could come to a stop right here and all walk away and feel like we've had a really rich discussion about U.S.-Japan security concerns.
Yes.
But don't go away. But the fact is, there is another important dimension, and that's traditional security concerns and the purview of the United States Department of Defense. And so in that sense, I'd love to be able to lead off. I'll do my introductions at first, but lead off with Grace Park, who is a senior official at the United States Department of Defense, who leads a team of 7 country directors that advise and support DoD leadership in setting the strategic direction and defense policy priorities for the United States-Japan alliance. In her background, she also has experience managing alliances, including with Australia, India, Philippines, and the Republic of Korea. So those are all sort of hot topics that are emerging and starting to blend into the U.S.-Japan space in ways that we're all aware of now. So I really appreciate your time and for being with us today. Next, Dr. Nakabayashi, can you hear me? Okay, we'll move to Frank Januzzi, who is the president and CEO of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Foundation, where he's been for 10 years at this point, so another 10-year anniversaries. Congratulations. Previously served at Amnesty International and came to Amnesty International after many years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where he served as senior Asia policy staff, advising now President Biden and then Secretary Kerry. Frank also did a Hitachi Fellowship with the Council on Foreign Relations in Japan, and so has deep and long expertise with Japan, but also Korea, and so is really a perfect person to join the conversation today. I'll also note that it dawned on me that we have some sort of hostile takeover of the Mansfield Foundation of this event today with, of course, Frank, but Dr. Nakabayashi is a senior fellow at the Mansfield Foundation. Dr. Goto is a fellow. David Bowling is a former vice president. And by God, I served there for almost 9 years. So that was unintentional, but it shows the depth and reach of the Mansfield Foundation. But now I think I can see Dr. Nakabayashi smiling, which means probably you can hear me. So I'd like to introduce you, Nakabayashi Sensei, and then I'm sorry, brutal to you because I know it's very late, but I'm going to suggest that you speak last in order, but let me introduce you now. Miyako Nakabayashi, I think, is familiar to many people in the room. She is a professor at the School of Social Sciences at Waseda University. she served for years in the Diet of Japan representing Yokohama, and her beat was also completely pertinent to this discussion, almost prescient. She was on the Foreign Affairs Committee, Financial Affairs Committee, and in fact the Special Committee on Anti-Piracy measures, as well as prevention of international terrorism and Japan's cooperation and support. So it's a wonderful panel of truly thoughtful and wonderful people, so I'm grateful to you all. But if I could start by turning to Grace to give kind of an upfront overview of what's happening at DoD, particularly with regard to the Alliance.
Sure thing, Ryan. Thank you very much for inviting me here today, and thank you to Ambassador Sumwalt, as well as the Japan-America Society of Washington, D.C., as well as, Ambassador Green, as well as the Wilson Center and Dr. Goto for this lovely 10-year event. It's remarkable how much has happened in January as the speakers and the questions that were coming through. I can hardly believe that within the past 25 days, we've been able to really strengthen and bolster the alliance in the way that we have, not just in the military space and defense space, but economic as well as the people-to-people connection. For myself, I'm speaking here on my personal capacity for my love of the alliance, not as a DoD official, but it's interesting to see the faces that circle in and out of this very, very tight-knit community. I remember when Ambassador Yamada was the political minister here about 10 years ago, and everything he says just rings true still today, especially that our alliance is a global partnership. And in the past 10 years, I've really seen Japan take the leadership role in a lot of places and domains where the United States, frankly, cannot, whether it's too contentious or whether it is too polarizing. And I believe that the United States has gained a lot from this alliance relationship. And, you know, Ambassador Emanuel, how can anyone describe Ambassador Emanuel in one word? But dynamic is what I try to put it. He is quite a visionary for us here in our government, and we really appreciate the close bonds that he creates in Tokyo, which has really driven the alliance closer and closer. So with that, in focusing my brief remarks on the security environment and how we at DoD, in cooperation with State Department, the National Security Council, Treasury, Commerce, all of the government agencies, are thinking through the alliance, it really comes down to 3 pillars for us at DoD. The first really being about modernizing roles and missions and capabilities of the alliance, especially given the changes in the security environment. Secondly, optimizing our force posture within the region, not just the United States with our allies in Japan, Philippines, Australia, but also Japan's own move to really fortify its own ability to enhance self-defense and its territorial defense. Lastly, the multilateral networking of our alliance and with Japan as the cornerstone, and I don't mean that in just the phrase and the catchphrase of the day way, it really is the backbone of all of our multilateral relationships in the region for the United States. And I know that is what really we're gonna speak to at the end of this panel, so I'll leave my remarks very, very faint on that. So the way we see the challenges today, we've got Russia's aggression against Ukraine. We've got the Red Sea, the Houthi attacks. There was more strikes overnight. The DPRK provocations, and of course, the aggression and constant coercive behavior of the PRC in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, as well as the Taiwan Strait. And in thinking through all of these networked security environments, I really did enjoy what our first panelists were saying. They're all interconnected. There's not very much an artificial line between economic coercion versus military coercion, right? They're all connected. And it's really a testament to Japan and how they're able to think through strategic messaging, how our counterparts are able to think through the the continuity of the rules-based order in all of these sectors that really brings us together in the international order. So with that, I believe that in modernizing our roles, missions, and capabilities, it's really about revamping our Alliance C2 this year, our command and control. That's what we're working on with Japan, especially with its establishment of the Japan Self-Defense Force Joint Operations Centers, the JJOC, which was previously known as the Permanent Joint Headquarters. And in working through the interoperability and the deepening of our capabilities together, our industrial cooperation is even burgeoning there too. So again, another head nod to the panelists from the first session. It's all connected for us here at the Department of Defense. In terms of the Japan JSDF Joint Operations Command, I think for the way that we're trying to think through how to enhance our interoperability, it's really about leveraging existing structures, including the alliance coordination mechanism, and thinking through, all right, what are the nitty-gritty details that we have to think through? Not just the people-to-people connections, the counterparts, the different types of combatant commands that the new JJOC will have to be able to think through in terms of coordination, but ensuring that if there is a contingency, we are all on the same page, looking at the same common operating picture or common information picture, and really thinking through, all right, who's got what roles and missions do you have in the geographic space, but also in the cross-domain space? Japan's commitment to increase its national defense budget for 2% is remarkable. That is, it's outstanding to me that we're in a place where they're not only thinking through the cyberspace, standoff capabilities, all the things that the budget says, but also to R&D, which is quite a new concept for my personal opinion, for MOD, for the Ministry of Defense. You've got people coming in from METI, going into ATLA, and going into different organizations of a very stovepiped bureaucracy. Just like the department, we have a very stovepiped bureaucracy as well, and the cross-pollination is going to do a ton of enhancements for our alliance itself. With that, in terms of modernizing roles, missions, and capabilities, we're also doing more in the ISR and in the maritime domain awareness field. For us, the bilateral information analysis cell that we just stood up with Japan was one of our big reveals for the 2023 2+2, the SecState, SecDef meeting last year. And for us, it's really speaking to Japan's capabilities and desire to be hands-on with their approach in contributing to peace and stability in the region. These MDA and ISR capabilities are not just for the self-defense of Japan, right? Excuse me. But really to enhance awareness and also stability throughout the East China Sea, South China Sea region, and it's incredible. What I will say, though, in terms of the industrial cooperation front, the recent 3Ps reform, the principles and technology transfers, has been, in December, has allowed exports of finished defense products manufactured in Japan, but under foreign license, sorry, this gets very complicated, to countries that hold patents for the equipment. So this is for us in the grand scheme of things, maybe it's a very small step, but it is a huge step for Japan, especially in its decision to provide Patriots that are manufactured in Japan to the United States to replenish our own stockpiles, given everything that's happening in Ukraine, given everything that's happening in different parts of the world where we are able to get Japan's Patriot missiles replenishing our stocks. And that really does enhance the stability of the Indo-Pacific region because you have a country that is becoming more of a hub, that is showing more capability and more commitment to creating peace and stability in the world. And so with that, I think I will move on to the posture discussion. For us, it is really about thinking through how not just the placement of peoples, the capabilities and forces in the Indo-Pacific region as the United States, it's more about thinking through how do we increase interoperability, how do we increase exercise and training in areas that are, quite frankly, a little bit contested already. Let's think about Japan Southwest Islands. Think about the August speaker visit back in 2023, in which Southwest Islands, Yonaguni, is only 80 kilometers from Taiwan. So if you're thinking through, let me correct that. The missile that PRC launched landed 80 kilometers away from Yonaguni. And so I think in terms of thinking about how it's not going to be an isolated contingency when we think about the way that campaigning works. Japan is very much linked in terms of its security to everything in that region. And so for us, we're really thinking about how do we make sure our alliance is positioned in more of a versatile, resilient way. And in terms of the U.S. forces, last year, we were really thinking through the 12th Marine Littoral Regiment that is in Okinawa now, as well as the Composite Watercraft Company in Yokohama North Dock. And for the next set of posture discussions, I think Japan has done a lot to help us with respect to bilateral exercises, with respect to training, and in terms of the resumption of construction at the Futenma replacement facility. There's just consistently daily activity. And so with that, I'll end my comments, but there's just a lot to talk about here, Ryan, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there is a lot to talk about, and it's striking to refer to Japan as the hub, which is wonderful, and I think something we've all been waiting for, but it also wasn't too long ago when we were referred to as the hub, or at least collectively. But anyway, with that, I'd like to turn to Frank and ask Frank to talk a little bit about some of the so-called mini-laterals that the previous panel alluded to as well, especially the one with the ROK. But another important mini-lateral that's been emerging, and that is with Australia. And in what ways is this changing our footprint and the capacity of the bilateral alliance? Frank.
Well, thanks so much, Ryan. Thanks, Shihoko, Ambassador Green. I'm delighted to be here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Woodrow Wilson Center shares many characteristics with the Mansfield Foundation. It's congressionally chartered, fiercely nonpartisan. You say that you're scholarship-driven. I think we are also scholarship-driven, but we're less of a think tank. We're more programmatic, small foundation. I'd say we're mission-driven, but it's really pleasant for me to be here and to help celebrate the 10th anniversary of this important dialogue. I also want to just, without blowing smoke, you can see how well served the Biden administration is. They attract really good people to public service, and I'm delighted to appear on this panel alongside Grace and with old friend Mieko Nakabayashi. And the alliance is in good hands, in part because it's in the hands of good people. And that's a testimony, I think, to the caliber of the folks that have been attracted to government service. This is likely to be a momentous year. Grace, you were asked to describe Ambassador Emanuel in one word, and I was worried there for a minute that you might use one of his favorite words to describe him. I don't know if badass is one word or two words. Maybe it's one word if you say it quickly enough. But the ambassador has done a remarkable job helping to guide what is a interest-driven transformation of Japan's defense posture. But what we saw at the end of last year with the changes in the defense security, national security posture of Japan is truly momentous. And it's really only acknowledging the shift that is coming. And we have yet to see the full implementation, right? And so I think we're going to witness over the coming year and years some real changes in Japan's role. And maybe we're going to need a new language. The cornerstone has been our go-to phrase for such a long time. I worry sometimes about how the cornerstone fits together with the linchpin. Linchpin is something you put on a wagon to keep the wheels from falling off. A cornerstone is a building which is solid and stable, and right there it is, momentous. And I think we need to harmonize our nomenclature. So maybe a task for the year is to get your public affairs folks to start thinking through new ways to describe this no longer hub and spoke architecture. What is it? I'm not sure. But let me speak to it briefly. That's too late for that. I'll try to be brief. It's a momentous year. There's going to be some change, but I think there's also some solidarity and continuity. One of the continuity areas is that the U.S.-Japan alliance does remain, as Mike Mansfield said, the most important bilateral relationship in the region for the United States, bar none. The Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States continues to rely on Japan as the essential partner. But more and more and more, this is a U.S.-Japan plus. So it's a U.S.-Japan plus Korea, U.S.-Japan plus Australia, U.S.-Japan plus Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, in areas of strategic critical minerals, in areas of maritime security, in areas of space and maritime domain awareness, in areas of working on climate change, which is an existential threat to some of the smaller Pacific islands that may no longer exist in the future. And so it's U.S.-Japan plus. And it's a kind of a functional minilateralism. It's not driven, frankly, even though people like to think that it is. It's not so much driven by perfect alignment of values. It's a deep alignment of interests. Those interests include, often, but not always, democratic values, human rights. But there are other times with other nations with whom the United States and Japan are partnering based on deep alignment of national security and economic interests that may not always include democratic principles or the same understanding of human rights. I'm a realist. I'm okay with that. I think the strongest of the partnerships are those that are cemented not only by the other national interests, but also by the commitment to human rights. And that is certainly true in the case of Japan, Australia, South Korea, right, Taiwan. But it's not true in the case of Vietnam. And that doesn't mean that the US and Japan don't have important common interests to pursue with the nation of Vietnam in the region. And I applaud the Biden administration for trying to walk this line. It's a difficult line to walk, where you're essentially upholding, on the one hand, a national commitment to promoting democratic governance, good governance, responsive governance, rule of law. And yet you're not, frankly, using that as some kind of a litmus test that prevents you from trying to find common ground where it needs to be found. It's not an intellectually satisfying position sometimes to be in, but I think it's the right way to lead the nation. So what we see is a value and interest-driven. The strength of this new triangle, the US-ROK-Japan triangle, is because it is, in fact, rooted in common values and interests. So it's got both dimensions of this going on. My proposition to you this morning is that it's going to outlast Yun Kishida. I know that there are many people in this room, maybe, and around the world who are worried about the resilience and the sustainability of the US-ROK-Japan triangle. I am less so, because I see that the ROK in particular, both progressives and conservatives, now acknowledge that China is not their friend, even though it is their largest trading partner. And public opinion about China in South Korea is at a nadir. It's at a very, very low point, and I don't think it's going to improve much anytime soon. And there's reasons for that, which have already been discussed in the first panel. But I see that the work of Mieko Nakabayashi and others who have tried to find a way forward on US-ROK-Japan triangle is going to be sustained after Yun, whether progressives win or conservatives win in the next election in Seoul. And it's going to be sustained past Kishida, no matter who follows him and when. And I think that it is going to be based on these common interests and common values. And I would just point to one data point. A lot of this does connect to people. And the number one traveling nation to Japan, South Korea. 6 million Koreans traveled to Japan in 2023, all right? The number one destination for Japanese when they travel abroad, Korea, accounting for 20% of all of the visitors to Korea last year. It's a smaller number, less than 1 million, but nonetheless, for Japanese travelers, number one. People to people is helping in the Japan-Korea relationship. It's helping to get beyond historical differences and have a forward-looking agenda for the two countries. And then it's cemented by things like supply chain resilience issues, semiconductors, high tech, battery technology, friendshoring, David called it, nearshoring. That is helping to underscore that functional minilateralism. And the same is true with countries like Australia. Australia has been a #1 exporter of coal for a long time in the Indo-Pacific. And now they recognize, because of climate change, that they need to probably move beyond that. So what can they do? They're working with Japanese and Koreans to look at hydrogen, to look at solar-produced hydrogen as a potential decarbonization source of Australian exports to Japan, to Korea, maybe to China. And I think that this is a new area of strategic economic connectivity, which augments also other kinds of strategic commitments, including freedom of navigation. Because if you're going to get that liquid hydrogen from Australia to Japan, you got to be able to sail through the waters of the East China Sea and the South China Sea and the Pacific without being worried that you're going to be interdicted by some Chinese EEZ. So I think Japan economic interests and strategic interests are in alignment, and they're in alignment not just with the United States, but also with South Korea and other important partners in the region, including Philippines, Indonesia, Australia. And I think all of this means we're going to see more US-Japan plus in the world, and that the vision that Abe laid out when he came to Washington, D.C., and he spoke about an alliance of hope on the floor of the US House, will come to pass. I say that not as an LDP partisan. Again, Mansfield Foundation is fiercely nonpartisan. It's just that the US-Japan alliance is no longer relegated only to the defense of the Japanese islands. It's what the US and Japan are doing globally to advance globally shared interests and norms in the economic space, in the military and security space, and indeed in outer space, and to the moon and beyond. So I'll stop there and welcome your questions and thoughts.
Thank you, Frank. It's helpful to reframe our thinking around US-Japan plus and sharing relationships, not just around common values, but common interests, and maybe relationships built around common interests that can come to share common values. With that, I want to delay for yet one more minute before getting to Nakabayashi-sensei to remind our audience, of course, in person, please formulate your questions as we sit here, but also online, you don't need to wait. You've got the chat feature underneath your screen, so you can pop questions in and they will be magically beamed up here onto my cell phone. So I'll repeat Dr. Goto's disclaimer. I'm not flipping through Instagram. I'm reviewing your questions thoughtfully. With that, I finally will turn to Nakabayashi-sensei, for whom it's 1:05 in the morning, and so we're deeply grateful to you. And I think that, behind the context, or the context behind all of these discussions, including the economic and trade discussion and economic security discussion we had this morning, is the political context. And it's easy to focus, of course, on our election that we have coming up in November, and it's important to do that because a lot could change, and a lot of the progress that the current administration has invested in may prove not to be robust, or maybe not. We don't know. But at any rate, I wonder if Nakabayashi-sensei, you could frame the political context a bit for us, of course, touching on our election with our friends in Taiwan just recently, but also maybe acknowledge some of the, it's not necessarily going to be a smooth road forward for Prime Minister Kishida either, so we could be looking at some political intrigue on the Japanese side as well. But at any rate, over to you, and thank you again for being up with us this late.
Thank you so much for your invitation, and congratulations on the 10th anniversary of your events. And I think I'm invited to send some air from Tokyo to Washington, and particularly domestic and global political circumstances would be very difficult to understand if you are away from that country or the place. First of all, because Ryan just mentioned about Taiwanese election. Japan was closely watching it because Taiwan is so close from Japan. And we are so afraid of Taiwan contingencies. And as all the panelists already pointed out, that Taiwan contingencies would affect Japan, Korea, and other nations in this region so much. And all the directions and issues mentioned by Grace and Frank, those are really, really true. And I deeply agree with them. But the problems are a little bit different when you look at domestic politics and elections. In Taiwan, of course, the party who are really close to the United States and somehow critical to Chinese Communist Party won. However, the legislative branch was actually divided. That means there may be some difficulties for a Taiwanese government to pursue exactly the same path that it took in the past. And Chinese government has more space to intervene into Taiwanese political understanding and participation by the people. And we witnessed so many cases of Chinese government somehow trying to influence its election. And there are lots of disinformation activities and fake news, so on and so forth. Therefore, we still need to watch Taiwan very closely and try to sort out what the right information and what are wrong information and so on. And Japan is deeply concerned about that and trying to work with Taiwan also closely. And Japanese security situation and budget that is increased from 1% of GDP to 2% is going to be spent for islands nearby Taiwan, which is southwestern Ryukyu, which is called, to northern Taiwan. Those are called Nansei Islands. Or Ryukyu Islands, chain of islands extending from, as I said, southwestern Ryukyu to northern Taiwan. Those are the chain islands that are truly trying to contain China to coming beyond Taiwan Strait and even trying to control trade and traffic of ships and important routes for Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, and so on. So it was a very important election just held in Taiwan, and Japan is truly starting to get interested in American elections. The presidential election as well as congressional elections are going to be held in November this year. And the primaries just started. And President Biden is really focusing on his first primary from now on. And it is really the start of US elections. Actually, several hours from now, I will be in a TBS station and talking about American elections. That much Japanese people currently started to interested in American politics. And I just had a telephone call from the TV station staff. And they said, well, we were away from American politics for a while. However, as we dig into all sorts of things that have happened and are expected to happen, it's going to be so exciting and stimulating our thoughts, and lots of things are going on. And we realize how important American elections are. So I just heard that maybe 2 hours ago, and that much American elections are so important to Japan, not only to Japan, but also Korea, Taiwan, everybody actually, all the nations in this region. I think Russia is closely watching or even trying to influence American elections from distance. China, of course, is extremely interested in American elections and quietly watching that. I heard from China expert in Japan that maybe China is not doing any military type of coercion against Taiwan because China doesn't want to anger the United States before the election. So China is quietly waiting for to see the outcome of American election. Also, Japan is facing lots of political events from now on. Even today, if you watch Japanese TV programs such as NHK Evening News at 7, at 9, all other BS stations, Fuji and others, all reported and called for specialists to come to their studios to talk about what's going on about LDP's factions. This is a very hot issue currently in Japan because it affects the ruling party's governance. Who are going to be chosen to control the government, cabinet, and all sorts of things. Whether Mr. Kishida can hold on to his power until his visit to Washington to have a state visit to the United States. It was actually rescheduled from March to April. Maybe because his internal political environment is in disarray, difficulty, in danger, and so on and so forth. I'm trying to share one slide with you because maybe this is your interest to see. I hope it works. Yes. This is in Japanese because this is reported just a few hours ago. There are faces of faction leaders. Abe faction is on the upper left. They have 98 people. Those numbers are numerical numbers, so you don't need to understand Japanese. And this is called Abe faction, and Shionoya-san is the leader of it currently. They decided to dissolve the faction. They're gone. And Mr. Nikai's faction has 38 people as of the 18th of this month, but they were also decided to get rid of it. Oh my goodness. Mr. Kishida is the first one to announce that he would dissolve his faction. He had 46 people in his faction, such as Mr. Hayashi, currently the chief cabinet secretary, is also Kishida faction. The foreign minister, who is that? The Kamikawa-san, is also from Kishida faction. This is a very influential faction because that is holding Japanese prime minister. But they decided to dissolve it, and it's gone. Also, Moriyama faction followed the suit. And Mr. Aso's faction decided to keep it. It has 56 people. And Mr. Motegi's faction, he also served as a foreign minister. He also, I think that was under Abe administration, I guess, or Suga. I'm not sure. But he was also a foreign minister, and he has 53 people in his faction. And interestingly, Mr. Suga is the leader of no-faction people. So there is a faction of no faction. And that has, yes, 97 people. And they are remaining as they are. So what's happening in the future in the Japanese politics? As you know, factions have been very important to promote people to take over ministers' seats, even to take over the prime minister's seat. And Mr. Kishida, as he displayed, it is important to balance those faction leaders' satisfactions so that the prime minister can be properly supported by all those people within the LDP. Now, 70% of LDP members have become no faction people. They're not affiliated to any factions. That is a huge, huge turn of event. And why that happened? Because Japanese election is coming, and I sensed that LDP members felt vulnerable if they don't do anything about the huge scandal that the LDP is facing regarding fundraising for the factions. Faction leaders had to actually record all the gathering of money, fundraising, the amount and where they're coming from, and report it to the Japanese government, and also the members of the factions had to report those financial accounting thing. However, they somehow didn't do that, and the dark money was criticized by the Japanese people very, very widely. And those scandal thing resulted in step down of some faction leaders and politicians. Even they were thinking to leave LDP, I hear, some of them. So it is very, very important time. And Japanese elections are not only LDP's leadership election, which is going to be held in September this year. But before that, in April, there are a few special elections to fill the vacant seats, and they may be affected by the financial scandals of the factions. Also, there is an important election for Tokyo Metropolitan City Assembly election. The governor's election, actually. Tokyo is so huge that the leader is called governor. And Ms. Koike is the current governor, and whether LDP is trying to challenge her or not may be difficult according to the current political situation. But there is a huge election there too, and we have to see what LDP would do and what the opposition parties would do. And then in September, there is a leadership election within the LDP, and in November, American presidential election is going to be held on the 5th. And next year, during summer, upper house election is going to be called in Japan. And that is also a very critical election. And in October next year, the tenure is going to be matured for the lower house members. So even if Mr. Kishida doesn't dissolve the diet and call for a snap election, he has to anyway have a general election, total election next year. He may call a snap election in order to minimize losing maybe LDP's seats, or if his popularity goes up sometime, then he may dissolve the diet to increase the party's membership. So it is totally up to Mr. Kishida's mind, but it is also affected by his popularity in order to dissolve the diet. So there are lots of little elections coming up, and at the same time, maybe Mr. Kishida's election is considered to be important, but more importantly, American election may affect Japanese politics, Japanese economy, Japanese national security, and international order. And if it is called Moshitora in Japanese, that means if Mr. Trump becomes the president, and Hobotora is maybe almost Trump, things like that. So there are two words in Japanese. Moshitora and Hobotora are very, very trendy words in Japan. And it's becoming even more trendy as November election approaches. But we are very, very worried, and we are thinking about a variety of scenarios of whoever becomes the president of the United States, and whoever are chosen for administrative staff or in high positions or in American cabinet, and also, how come we are trying to understand U.S. politics, and how come the people are supporting Mr. Trump? And maybe tomorrow, in several hours, actually, not tomorrow, maybe tonight, today, I might have to say that people in Washington, like people here gathering in this room, are very decent people, and everything the panelists, for example, today expresses makes sense. I think that is all correct, and I totally agree with them. However, somehow, people out there in different states may have different feeling, and we don't understand that very well. And Japanese people try to understand it as the election approaches. And I may have to mention that, well, maybe American people are feeling a little bit tired of being the model of democracy in the world and the leader of the world to keep the international order that is so difficult these days. Everybody is so selfish, self-centered, and developing all sorts of dangerous weapons and trying to coerce others, breaking all the rules of laws. And how come only the United States can keep the international orders that has been so securely protected by the United States? So my guess and my explanation, if, for example, people choose someone who is so outrageous, then maybe the people are thinking something differently about the United States as a nation. So that's what we are really worried and sensitive about. So if we can discuss about that kind of things, it would be wonderful. And I really want to learn from the panelists too, so that I can explain to the Japanese people about the American state of politics. That's it. Thank you so very much.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much, and you have a remarkable ability to be cogent at a very late hour. But let me actually return right back to you, Nakabayashi Sensei, and we do have some questions coming in online, and I'm sure that people in the audience have some too. But I think we have an easy time understanding this, what is at stake with the American election. But you referred to in particular, the slush fund scandal that's affecting Japan's factions. And I think that's a subject that's less well understood. I just wonder, in this city anyway, I wonder if you could help us understand what is at stake in the outcome of, wherever we're heading right now with the dissolution of factions.
Okay, yes. Prime Minister Kishida actually called for reform committee or blue ribbon, I think, committee type of thing, so that he and other people who are knowledgeable about Japanese politics can come up with a solution. But before coming up with a total solution, because the committee members include Mr. Aso and Mr. Suga and all sorts of different people who have different opinions, Mr. Kishida stated that as the leader of LDP, the factions will not have any parties anymore to collect money, because parties are the real tool for the factions to collect money without breaking laws. And Mr. Kishida stated, well, factions cannot recommend any members to the prime minister to be appointed as cabinet members. Those are the real political, actually, activities that factions had. And it was the characteristics of LDP for many, many years. That means some people say that prime minister has more power. All the power is concentrated to the prime minister. So it's going to be more authoritarian type of LDP governance that we may have to witness. But at the same time, some people said, well, 70% of LDP members became unaffiliated to any factions. That means they are going to realign that kind of grouping, and they will start something else. For example, a study group. There are caucuses already for policy alliance, but caucuses are not the true money and power and position searching type of people. And the factions played an important role in that regard. Therefore, they survived for many, many difficulties for many years. And they have faced an extremely difficult time. However, they may somehow have some kind of realignment and form some kind of groups. And then again, they revive like zombie. Some people say that. So, which is true? Maybe the latter one is true in the long run. And in the short term, maybe Mr. Kishida has a concentrated power. It would be very interesting to see how things can unfold from now on.
I think that with everything that people have to think about these days, the imagery of rising zombies is one that we could probably do without. But that's extremely helpful. And I wanted to then just focus out a little bit and talk about the speed with which all of this is unfolding, both politically, socially, and in terms of our alliances, and but also our security or bilateral alliance modernization that both Grace Park and the ambassador talked about. I think that Japan is not a country that's known for its speed in making major changes. I mean, typically we would expect to see a study and consensus form. Maybe over the period of decades, but we're talking about, defense spending increase on a much shorter time frame, and we're talking about any kind of reorientation of posture and priorities under a much shorter time frame. Because you alluded to some sort of a kinetic incident affecting Taiwan within a year. So we don't have a decade. So I wonder, and I'd love to start with Grace, if I could put you on the spot, if from the DoD perspective, sorry, from your personal perspective, but in the auspices in which you've gained experience, if you can talk a little bit about your observation of the change of pace at which things are happening. Is the pace changing? Or is it changing fast enough? But then to touch on both of the other conversations with Frank and Miyako, a trilateral cooperation between the ROK and Japan is in some ways controversial, at least at certain levels. Talking about contingencies in Taiwan, that was unheard of just 3 years ago even, but now we're talking about it openly in this room. What about the Japanese public? Is there a tolerance for this rapid pace? Is this an invitation for some of the populism that you referred to, Nakabayashi-sensei, in Japan? But on that general topic, let me open it up and start with Grace.
Sure, thank you. And Nakabayashi-sensei, I kind of chuckled when you said, "Aren't you guys tired about leading the world?" And quite frankly, I'm energized because I don't feel like the United States is taking on the burden or the full responsibility. Japan is doing so much, and so with respect to your question, Ryan, about the pace of our defense modernization, as well as Japan's own decisions to push through their defense buildup program, I think it's been quite welcome over here in DC, especially because we are so aligned in how we think about the world. Frank, you mentioned our common values as well as our common interests, but I think that I can't agree with you more on that. It's very clear that when I'm working with my counterparts that we're so aligned not just on the strategic vision, but also on the methods to get there. And so the close collaboration we have with our counterparts, it feels like hand in glove. And yeah, we might not agree sometimes, but we're so frank in our discussions that it doesn't feel like you need to have, 3 different discussions to say exactly what you want. It's just very clear cut, and it's very dynamic in a way that you have folks like Ambassador Yamada, Ambassador Emanuel, who are extremely wedded to this alliance. And so I think in terms of the appetite for the pace, I've only heard and seen from my seat a deeper desire from Japanese political constituents to be protected, especially in this dangerous neighborhood. Frank?
Yes, well, I agree with Grace. Where I worry is not the management of the U.S.-Japan alliance in taking on the challenges that we're facing, whether it's enhanced Chinese assertiveness in the East China Sea and the South China Sea, whether it's rules violations by DPRK with respect to UN sanctions or the gross violation of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What I worry is really about the sustainability of the U.S. commitment. So in this, I have to echo a little bit the nervousness that I'm hearing from Nakabayashi-sensei. And I know my friends in Japan are looking at the United States nervously about the sustainability of our commitments. And we have a Senate Majority Leader who appears prepared to sacrifice U.S. strategic interests in the security of Europe for political expediency at home on the immigration border issue. That does not inspire confidence. I had a conversation with a woman who is now a senior official in Taiwan. And I asked her, before she became a senior official in Taiwan, what should the U.S. do about Ukraine? Should we focus on Taiwanese security issues, or should we focus on Ukraine? Can we do both? Do we have to make a choice? And her answer was unequivocal. She said, your commitment to Ukraine enhances Taiwan's security, because Taiwan's security is about more than just Patriot batteries and ships and flotillas and advanced munitions. It's about the credibility of the American deterrence and the credibility of America's commitment to friends and allies and to the international rules-based order. And if Ukraine goes down, at the hands of Russian aggression, Taiwan will be less secure. Full stop, period, end of sentence. And I thought it was a very interesting answer because it is not what some of the friends of Taiwan are saying in this town, who say that our commitment to Ukraine is a diversion of precious resources that we can't afford. And so I worry about the sustainability, and I say it, I'm worried about it now. Don't get me talking about November, right? That's a whole nother level of worry, right? But right now, the United States is facing this kind of a crisis. And so it's not a surprise to me that friends in Korea or Japan are worried. And I will, at the risk of putting a downer on this morning's session, I will say that all of what I said about the sustainability of the US ROK Japan triangle, I believe in my gut, and also as someone who's studied this triangle for 40 years. That doesn't mean that it's unbreakable. And the easiest way to break it, in my opinion, would be for the United States to, in the future, somehow compromise the extent of our commitment to the security of our allies in Northeast Asia by questioning the value of an alliance, by proposing the withdrawal of US forces from the Korean Peninsula, by cutting an unwise deal with North Korea that cuts out the security interests of Japan or South Korea. Steps such as those could set in motion catastrophic events in the region. First, ROK going nuclear. Second, Japan and Taiwan going nuclear. And those events severing the goodwill and comity and trust that exists between ROK and Japan today. Because I don't think the ROK-Japan comity would survive the two nations going nuclear and abandoning their commitment to the NPT. This may sound apocryphal to this audience in DC. I just want you to invite you to look over the horizon a little bit at a very different future that is not so inconceivable to me. You know, if the United States were to fundamentally realign its defense commitments, you know, in Northeast Asia. And at the risk of going long, I will say that, you know, I once had a discussion with then Senator Biden about the circumstances under which Korea or Japan would ever go nuclear. And I was a young 33-year-old Senate staffer, former Intel guy. And Biden was, you know, at that time already a veteran of 24 years in the US Senate. And he said to me, you know, Frank, the minute that Japan doubts our commitment, you know, and the nuclear umbrella to their security, you know, they will rethink their non-nuclear posture. And I looked at him like he was a crazy man. I was like, Senator, you don't understand Japan. This is a country that has a strong pacifist sentiment. This is the only country on the planet that was subjected to a nuclear attack. This is a country that is committed wholesomely to the NPT and non-proliferation and all the rest. And he said, Frank, don't lecture me about national interest. Japan will act according to its national interest. You know, and Japan's national interest will be fundamentally altered if the US removes the nuclear umbrella, removes its commitment. And Japan will do what Japan has to do. Now, at the time, Biden did not convince me. I was not persuaded by that argument. 20 years later, I am. I think Biden was very prescient. I think it's one of the reasons why he's so committed to the US-Japan alliance, as well as to the US-ROK alliance, and as to the US-ROK-Japan triangle, because Biden, more than any leader in my lifetime, gets the strategic downside risk. It's not a certainty. It's not a certainty, but there's a significant downside risk associated with that kind of a change in the US strategic posture. So just a cautionary tale, elections matter, choices matter, and it's not just about the individuals, and it's also partly about what we're doing right now. People are watching.
Nakabayashi-sensei, did you want to comment as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
I actually completely agree, and that could be the case. Therefore, we have to really voice our opinions so loud and echo these kind of things to the world. but at the same time, why, for example, Ms. Haley, who knows international problems, and she actually supported Ukraine and so on, wouldn't get as much support in the primaries. Even in New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a moderate state, and independent people can vote, but still couldn't win against Mr. Trump. And Mr. Trump is so popular. That's why it is so difficult to comprehend what's going on. Maybe when it becomes nationwide election, things can change. But how we can understand the elections in American politics that affects all the nations close to the United States?
Yeah.
Nakabayashi Sensei, I want to help you on your TV interview tomorrow morning.
Yes, please. I need that. I need that.
I spend a lot of time in Montana. Thanks to Mike Mansfield and Maureen Mansfield being from Montana, the Mansfield Foundation isn't a Washington inside the Beltway kind of place. And I spent a lot of time in Montana, where Trump won by about 30 points in 2020, and where if he's the nominee, he will win by about 30 points in 2024. And I speak to people in Montana about why that is, and the answers are not so complicated. The people of Montana are against immigration because they feel it's changing America. They are against multiculturalism because they feel that it's imposing someone else's values on their own values. They're against globalism because they think that foreign countries cheat, and they do. I mean, Ambassador Emanuel spoke about China's cheating, but they think that globalism somehow essentially is making America vulnerable to the cheating of others. They're against spending money abroad because they see homeless people on the streets of Missoula, and they wonder why we're sending billions of dollars to Ukraine. They are against living in a society that is multiracial. And they are overwhelmingly white in Montana, and multicultural, multiracial societies make them nervous and uncomfortable. This is the essence to me about the Trump voter. And then I would throw in that the people of Montana don't like to be lectured that they have to tolerate LGBTQ. They don't like to be lectured that they need to drive an electric car or use an electric stove or eat vegan meat instead of bison and beef. They don't want to turn their thermostat down in the summer or up in the winter, you know? And all of that they associate with a liberal democratic ethos that knows better than they do about how they're going to live their lives. That's it. This is the essence of the election that we're facing in November. And it's not because these Montana voters are stupid. It's because they do not align with many of the values that are treasured here inside the Beltway of Washington, or in many, many, many other states, you know, and by a majority, I would argue, from the results of the 2020 election, of the American people. You know, so if there's a silver lining to all of my doom and gloom, it's that, you know, Biden won the last election on a different kind of agenda than the agenda that many voters in Montana are going to vote for in 2024. And he, if he's the nominee of the Democratic Party, as I assume he will be, he may win the election in 2024 as well, because the American democracy kind of functions, and people vote, hopefully.
Yeah.
But this is that's what I hear when I go to Montana.
Yes. That makes sense. Everything is domestic, right? Nothing about international order or American leadership.
No, very little.
In terms of democracy or whatever.
I think it's not accidental that this and every other conversation turns back to American political analysis. But let me turn to the audience and maybe take your questions. And I do have a couple online that I'd like to pose. The gentleman right in the middle, in the back row. And please state your name and affiliation if you could.
My name is Sang-Bin Lee. I'm a reporter from the Radio Free Asia. I have a question about North Korea issue to Ms. Grace Park. From this year, United States, Japan, South Korea begin to regularize exercise for multi-year plan. So I want to know any background why do you have such this multi-year plan among 3 countries? And also, is including the ground forces exercise will be including this plan? Because if Japanese ground force come to South Korea, maybe South Korea doesn't want to Japanese ground force South Korean peninsula. So can you tell me about that?
Thank you.
Sure. So your question is on the background for the development of this multi-year exercise plan, as well as what types of exercises we're trying to foresee, right? So for the multi-year plan that was announced at the Camp David Summit Trilat in August, back with President Biden, President Yoon, as well as Prime Minister Kishida, it was very much a landmark event because you have all these 3 leaders seeing what's happening with DPRK. You're looking at the threats. You're looking at all the, not only the missile testing or the launches, but also just the rhetoric, right, and everything that's going on the peninsula. For us, the multi-year plan really just reinstituted things that we have done as 3 countries in ebbs and flows, of course, but in a way that really practically thinks through what is the threat, what do we have to be prepared to do as 3 countries together in order to have interoperability, in order to have coordination if things happen on the peninsula. I think with respect to what types of exercises there's a lot of anti-submarine warfare, search and rescue, HADR. These are normal things that would happen in order to increase stability in the region. And with respect to your question about ground force movements, I honestly, I think that's more operational from where I sit, so I can't speak to those plans. But what I can tell you, though, is we, at the policy level, understand very much the deep historical issues that that the ROK and Japan are working through. And so we, as the United States, our only point is, without the trilateral relationship, all 3 countries will suffer from any of the emerging threats, especially DPRK in the region. And so understand the sensitivities, and personally, I feel that in thinking through how we're looking at scoping these exercises, maritime, air, land, we really have to think through what is the realistic threat, and really think through, are we prepared as a country, right? And so understand that this is a very hot button issue for folks, and I, as an American, cannot pretend to understand either side, but for us in the United States, it's really important that we have this trilateral cooperation to deter and defend against real threats. Do you want to say anything, Frank? I know you're a trilateral expert.
I couldn't improve on your answer.
Well, why don't we stick to the granular, but at the same time go back global? And we got a question from Colby Badwar at The Insider about Japanese-produced Patriot missiles to the U.S., of which there's been some discussion already this morning, and whether there's an opportunity for the Japanese manufacturer to receive a contract to produce them on an ongoing basis, or if we're talking about something more limited in time frame.
For sure. So I think that is definitely a government Japan policy decision. That's something that we at the United States government, or I personally, Grace Park, can't speak to, because those are decisions that we really have to think through. But what I can say personally is think about the ramifications of such a huge step forward for Japan, a Japanese industry, not just to America and our industrial cooperation bilaterally, but what that means for Japan's industry in India, with India, the cooperation with any of the Southeast Asian countries. It's a huge launching pad and an opportunity if you think about it. So I really do hope that there's more progress in the 3Ps reform sessions.
And I would just add that what we've seen from Japan in the last year or two, as the administration has adopted a much more engaged posture on defense cooperation with nations beyond the U.S. We've seen the sending of Coast Guard vessels to Vietnam and the Philippines. We've seen the beginnings of a Japanese, if you will, sort of arms export or arms transfer capability, which is new. And I think that trend line is likely to continue. And I think that the idea that Japan has the capacity, the industrial capacity, it's already demonstrated, whether it's the cooperation with us, NASA and JAXA in space, or cooperation on advanced defense systems that they have demonstrated in the deployment of their Navy and Air Force. Japan has the capability to do more. And frankly, Japanese weapon systems are very expensive, in part because Japan has not been an exporter of weapon systems. You contrast it with Korea, where they generate significant revenue from the export of U.S. interoperable, high-quality equipment at a much lower price. I think Japan is being market-driven partly here to consider fulfilling defense orders for U.S. alliance partners abroad. And I think that's probably a good thing.
Nakabayashi-sensei?
Yes, very interesting subject. I hear that within the LDP coalition, part of the government is Kometo, and Kometo is a little closer to China and trying to be pacifist still now. And they were actually opposing to stepping forward in a speedy manner. That's what I heard, and I felt so critical about having coalition with Kometo as such, and what the LDP really wants. Kometo has huge power to send one minister to London space construction type of ministry. And other factions, for example, Abe faction has, in my chart, as just you saw, 98 people are joining, and they are going to be gone, although they had that kind of agenda to be pushed because the faction had so many people, and they wanted to proceed with more active participation in defense matters and Japanese role in this region. But again, this is another internal situations and how Mr. Kishida can lead the party. Although there is still maybe a difficulty coming from Kometo, but he may be able to exercise more leadership. And it is Mr. Kishida who declared to raise the defense budget from 1% to 2% of GDP. So he may know how to deal with this kind of issues. And I think mindful people in international situation and security issues are hoping that Japan can move swiftly to cooperate with countries like the United States.
I think when he visits in April, that'll be undoubtedly a subject of discussion. And that's a much more positive note to end on, especially than zombies. So I think we will, and I apologize, I know that there are some questions in the audience, but I would like to ask you all to join me in thanking our panel, and especially Nakabayashi-sensei for enduring some late hours of the evening. So thank you so much. Just a few quick closing remarks from me, and I don't know if Dr. Okay. So I wanted to thank again the Wilson Center for gracious hosting of this event. They're an incredibly strong supporter of Japan America Society of Washington, D.C., as I know many of you are as well, so I thank you. I did want to call out in particular some of our strongest supporters at the corporate level, including AFLAC, Kirin, ANA, Panasonic, Toyota, and two friends who have been invoked earlier in the discussion, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Tokyo Electron. But with that, thanks again to all of you for joining in the room on a not very nice day and in cyberspace where it's always sunny, and we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Hey.